Victorian London in 1888, and a horrific spree of murders took place that to this day remain a mystery. So the Whitechapel murderer, Leather Apron, or Jack the Ripper as he became to be known, prowled the dim and murky back streets of England's capital city, killing prostitutes in such a hideous fashion that to this day it's the story that nightmares are made of. Yes, the brutal murders of the prostitutes shocked the nation, and their names became forever immortalized through tragedy and time. The 5 canonical murders.
You keep making words up tonight, Dave. Canonical.
He's always making words.
What was that enigma word you made up a minute ago?
I don't know. I knew it began with an E and ended with a M, so I thought it was fairly safe. Let's start at the beginning. The first murder was, out of the 5, was a Mary Polly Nichols. Well, Polly Nichols, because I feel like with the amount of reading I've been doing recently, I've got the right to call her by a nickname. So Polly, this 31st of August, 1888, and the body was found at 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row in Whitechapel. An acquaintance came across her, drunk and staggering in the darkness at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Her throat was cut and pilled in blood, and only when her body was stripped in the primitive local mortuary were the horrible incisions to her abdomen discovered, and her intestines that were pretty much uncontained by the abdominal wall within the cavity was almost trying to pop out, from what the autopsy report says. She was also the first victim to be disemboweled. The odd thing about this is that no one noticed it, as I said before, until she was at the mortuary, and everybody seemed to sort of like attribute that the whole mess, or that the fact that she was so covered in blood that she was just down to the slit throat alone. And even once it had been found out that she'd been disemboweled, a worker at the morgue undressed her and went about washing down her body and everything before the investigators could even collect any kind of evidence. It says, upon further examination of her body, Dr. Llewellyn discovered that both sides of her face had been bruised by either a fist or the pressure of a thumb for her throat. Wounds had been inflicted from left to right. And one of these 2 wounds measured 8 inches and the other 4 inches in length, and both reached back to her vertebral column. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and her abdomen had been mutilated with 1 deep, jagged wound, 2 or 3 inches from the left side. Several incisions had also been inflicted across her abdomen, causing her bowels to protrude through the wounds, and 3 or 4 similar cuts ran down the right side of her body. These cuts had also been inflicted with the same knife, estimated to be at least 6 to 8 inches long, and possibly a cork cutter or shoemaker's knife. Each wound had been inflicted in a violent and downward thrusting manner. Llewellyn further opinionated, it says opined, his belief the murderer possessed some anatomical knowledge, and no organs were missing. He also estimated the injuries would have taken 4 to 5 minutes to complete, and also expressed his surprise at the small amount of blood at the crime scene, about enough to fill 2 large wine glasses or half a pint at the outside. He believed Nichols would have been facing her attacker when he had held his hand across her mouth before cutting her throat. Death would have been instantaneous, and all her abdominal injuries, which would have taken less than 5 minutes to perform, were made by the murderer after she was dead. He was also able to determine this fact because wounds inflicted to an individual's body after death do not result in blood spattering and may not result in an extensive amount of blood loss from the body.
On the 8th of September in 1888 then, according to both the lodging house deputy, Timothy Donovan, and the watchman, John Evans, shortly after midnight, Chapman had been lacking the required money again for a nightly lodgings in one of these common lodgings that was, I suppose, prevalent in Whitechapel in that period. It was too expensive for people to afford their own property. No, sorry, 8 pence for a double, 4 pence for a single, and 2 pence to stand and sleep in one of these lodgings. And but what the problem was that most of them drank away most of the money they'd earned from prostitution. Now, approximately 1:35 a.m., that's when she returned with the food. She got chucked out at that point, and then disappeared into the streets of Whitechapel shortly after that. Found to have had a throat slit from left to right, almost, I think, so deep it went back to the spinal column. Disembowelment seeming to be a common theme of of the Jack the Ripper cases. John Richardson, a local neighbour, went to the back of his property apparently to trim a loose piece of I don't know, of leather on his boot, where he then noticed some noise and commotion coming from the back of his property, but he decided not to investigate and just left it. Approximately, I think 5:15 a.m., a tenant of 27 Hambury Street, Albert Kadosh, entered the yard to use his lavatory in his back garden, where he heard a woman say no before hearing this sound as well, or something falling against his back fence. And again decided not to investigate this noise coming from between 27 and 29 Hambury Street.
You got to love the way these Victorians wrote the words. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. It must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade and must have been at least 6 to 8 inches in length, probably longer. You should say that the injuries could not have been inflicted by a bayonet or a sword bayonet. You got to love the Victorians. Could have been done by a post-mortem knife, but ordinary surgical cases don't usually carry post-mortem knives. He thought the knives used by those in the leather trade or slaughtermen were well ground down might have caused it as well. And he thought there were indications of anatomical knowledge. And he should say that the deceased would have been dead at least 2 hours, probably more, when he first saw her, but it was right to mention that it was a fairly cool morning and that the body would be more apt to cool rapidly from his having lost a great quantity of blood.
But there is an ongoing idea, there isn't there, that some of these murders were committed elsewhere. That's like you talked about in the first murder, how they talked about there wasn't enough blood. But the problem with that is quite a small amount of blood can look quite large and vice versa, particularly if somebody had their throat cut very quickly. But also, if you then throw in things like alcoholism, they don't bleed as much.
So after Annie Chapman on the 8th of September, we start to get the letters. We start to get the letters, and the first one is the Dear Boss letter, which was on the 26th of September, I believe. Yeah, 26th of September, 1888. Let's show the Dear Boss letter, shall we?
This sent to Charles Warren, the police commissioner.
26th of September 1888, said, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till they do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I've saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over from the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police office just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. And then he was nice enough to give us a PS. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands, curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. So clearly a well-adjusted individual, has to be said.
So the police actually received up to 700 letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. But this is one of the first ones that's considered to be, even though at the time it was believed to be a hoax and possibly written by somebody from the Daily Star, or was it the News of the World?
Yeah, it was put down to be a reporter. Yeah, even they sort of like had that ideology back then that it was down to a reporter. So, Dear Boss,
the ears clipping point, isn't it? That's the point that's interesting because her ears were stabbed at or cut. Chapman's. So they said that's the interesting point that really comes out and think this might actually be genuine. This might actually be real.
Elizabeth, or Long Liz, as she was known, Stride. She lived at number 32 Flower and Dean Street. She'd been out drinking at the Queen's Head pub. It was raining heavily. At 11:45 p.m., she was seen with a man in Burner Street by a William Marshall. And 11:45 to 12 a.m., storekeeper Matthew Packer claimed to have sold her some grapes to her and the man that she was with. At 12:30 a.m. on the same night, P.T. William Smith saw her and the man or a man standing outside Dutfield's yard on Burn Street. And at 12:45 a.m., Israel Swartz saw her being assaulted and thrown to the ground in front of Dutfield's yard. And at this point, he was on the other side of the road, I think walking to work. And there was another man on the same side of the road that he was on, trying to light his pipe. 1 a.m. in the morning, Louis Dimes Scuts, having trouble with names again. He pulled into Dutfield's yard and found a body. So the body was still warm, with a 6-inch slice on her throat. She was found to be holding a little box of sweets and a handful of grapes. And she also had a flower pinned to her jacket, which she didn't have on previously when she went out. And from that murder, a lot of people think that this isn't one of the Jack the Ripper murders because she wasn't mutilated. So yeah, that's a tricky one. So her hands were cold, but the rest of the body was quite warm. And holding the sweets and the grapes. So, but again, a lot of people don't count this one as being a Jack the Ripper murder. But
they called her Lucky Liz, didn't they? Because she only got her throat split.
It's a tricky one.
I think the theory of the interruption and then why he then went immediately only 2 streets away and committed another murder almost immediately. That was confusing for people at the time because that didn't happen, or it had never happened before. Now we look back on these things knowing a lot more about serial killers that we know nowadays and know that a murderer in that situation, if he were to be interrupted, it's more than common for them to then go and have to scratch that itch, as it were.
Yeah,
very much so, yeah.
This is one of the stories always where there's one theory that somebody ran up to a policeman and shouted that there's been a murder, and pointed the policeman in the direction. He then gave a name that turned out to be false, or they couldn't follow him up afterwards. There is a theory to believe that he was interrupted, that the man with the cart appeared, Jack the Ripper ran, believed he might get caught. So,
because he said there was another police officer there when there wasn't as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But when that police officer got there was a police officer there.
Yeah, he's told me to go and get you, sort of thing, and they all blew their whistles, didn't they? Come running, sort of thing. Because there was a large police presence in the area by that point.
Wasn't the only murder this night, because as alluded to before, is that another word just made up by Dave? You have to find it out yourselves. But as it was alluded to before,
alluded to is a word. I know that.
He was quietus interruptus. In fact, he was very interruptus. He was very interruptus. Catherine Eddowes, she was found drunk in Aldgate High Street at 8:30 on the evening of the 29th of September, 1888. By P.C. Louis Robinson. Sounds like a boxer. He picked her up and propped her up against the shutters of a shop. She slipped over drunkenly, sideways, and after a few hours in the cells at Bishopsgate Police Station, she'd recovered a little bit from a binging and was ready to be released. Yeah, she pulled open the door to the police station and turned left and headed away from Whitechapel. And now it was 1 o'clock in the morning, 30th of September. A short distance away to the east in Dutfield Yard had filled with people. Within 45 minutes, Catherine too would be found dead. Her injuries were a record of somebody's brutality. And again, there was no sign of the perpetrator, as they say in Brooklyn. A big bunch of detectives found out because, as we said before, there was a large police presence around Whitechapel and Spitalfields because of the previous murders. And this from Mitre Square, which was I believe that area is the scene of where she was killed, and back in the direction of Whitechapel. And 2 clues were discovered near her body, apparently. A piece of Catherine's apron had been cut, and the missing portion stained with blood was discovered in a doorway. Above it was some anti-Semitic graffiti, which was unseen by the policeman on his previous rotation. So a police officer had been walking around the area. That hadn't been there. Her body was discovered. Then all of a sudden, this graffiti was on the wall, as well as a fragment of her apron. This was about a third of a mile from the murder scene, in the passage of a doorway leading to 108 to 119 Golston Street in Whitechapel. In on the wall of the doorway, which read either, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," or "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." And at 5 a.m., Commissioner Warren attended the scene and ordered the words erased for fear that they would spark anti-Semitic riots. From what they said about her, no other victim had been placed in the same kind of manner that she had, and the way that she'd been, the way that she'd been murdered. You see, they had black and white drawings back in those days, and then they eventually moved on to colour, a bit like we did with TV 100 years later. So there you've got a colour version, a colourised version, or colorised version for our friends in the US who can't spell A.
Hey, if you're going to take our language, at least spell it correctly.
He was allowed to give full vent to what he wanted to do when he murdered the unfortunate Catherine Eddowes, barely an hour later. And we'll move on to the mortuary photo. Okay, so the autopsy said the body was on its back, the head turned towards the left shoulder, and the arms by the side of the body as if they had fallen there, both palms upwards and the fingers slightly bent. A thimble was lying off the finger on the right side, the clothes drawn up above the abdomen, and the thighs were naked. The left leg extended in a line with the body, and the abdomen was exposed. The right leg bent at the thigh and knee. The bonnet was at the back of the head, and there was a great disfigurement of the face. The throat was cut. Across below the throat was a neckerchief. The intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared over with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet was quite detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and auricle of the right ear were cut obliquely through. There was a quantity of clotted blood on the pavement on the left side of the neck, around the shoulder and upper part of the arm, and fluid blood-coloured serum which had flowed under the neck to the right shoulder, the pavement sloping in that direction. The body was quite warm. No death stiffening had taken place, and she must have been dead most likely within the half hour. We looked for superficial bruises and sawn on, and no blood on the skin of the abdomen or secretion of any kind on the thighs. No spurting of blood on the bricks or pavement around. No marks of blood below the middle of the body. Several buttons were found in the clotted blood after the body was removed. There was no blood on the front of the clothes. There was no traces of recent connection. The cause of death was hemorrhage from the left common carotid artery. The death was immediate, and the mutilations were inflicted below the middle of the body. The peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side, and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. The parts removed would be of no use for any professional purpose. It required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Such a knowledge might be possessed by one in the habit of cutting up animals. I think the perpetrator of this act had sufficient time. It would take at least 5 minutes. I believe it was the act of one person.
That's a slaughter.
Yeah, it seems brutal, doesn't it? Frenzied, like we've said, like being stopped from doing what he wanted to achieve earlier that evening.
It's totally congruent with somebody in a psychopathic rage, when he gets frustrated on one, and he would just be walking, and he'd probably just walk straight up to it, and just wouldn't have been any hesitation at all. It was in pure rage.
Now we've got the Saucy Jack postcard, which was received on the 1st of October 1888. They might know it. That's the front of it there. The text of the postcards read, I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off the police. Thanks for keeping last letter. Back till I get to work again. Jack the Ripper.
Thank you.
This is when he started sending letters to Lusk as well, though, isn't it?
We got that one as well, yes.
That's completely different handwriting, that one, to the first letter.
That's not particularly unusual with people with psychotic tendencies, weirdly.
No, I suppose you split personality. You could have two handwriting styles, couldn't you, potentially?
I mean, you know from yourself as well. I mean, I know my handwriting changes wildly depending on which pen I'm using. It can change quite dramatically.
I don't know. That first letter, that first letter indicated calligraphy and indicated like the use of like a fountain pen and clever squiggles, and this one's much more of a more basic form of writing, I would argue.
There's a lot of arguments about the letters and which ones are fake. Like I said, they received 700 letters purporting to be from Jack the Ripper. At least 300 were clear hoaxes, and then they had to dwindle them down. These ones are particularly interesting though because there's certain information that the police retained, like the clipping of the ears. So when they get these letters, they think, right, we didn't make that public. So it makes it. This is why these ones are considered to be more likely to be genuine. Yeah,
it gives it more credence, doesn't it? Okay, so our mate Lusky, George Lusk, I believe he was the president of the Whitechapel Vigilante Commission. This one, by most ripperologists, because we love using that word, ripperologists is considered to be genuine correspondique, or correspondence if you speak real languages. So this is known as the From Hell or the Lusk letter. Okay, so there's the From Hell letter. Also the name of a good version of a good film which covers the Jack the Ripper case, I believe. So From Hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, I believe it's trying to say, but sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the piece I fried. So I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I might send you the bloody knife, and that took it out if only you wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. Now, this is probably, I mean, they're all famous. They're all infamous. They're all famous murders. Each of the five victims are just as important as the other, if you like. But this is probably, well, without a shadow of a doubt, it's the most gruesome one. Yeah. And we're talking about Mary Jane Kelly, Mary Kelly, and Jamie.
That's me.
Floor is yours.
I agree with you on that, Dave. I think, honestly, if it wasn't for this murder, Jack the Ripper might have slipped into the annals of history and sort of thing to be forgotten. This murder, I think, shocked the world, sort of thing. So Mary Jane Kelly, she was 25. She was much younger than the other victims. She was considered very attractive, very popular in the area. She was murdered in Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street in Spitalfields. You can see there that the broken glass, that was, she'd had a fight only a few weeks before with Joseph Barnett, who actually she lived with until literally 2 weeks before her murder. He was out of work, and so they were struggling to get an income to pay for the rent. So she turned to prostitution, which caused lots of arguments in the relationship, as it would. And he ended up, she actually ended up bringing home a homeless prostitute one night, and that was it for Joseph. He said, right, that's it, I've had enough now. Even though they stayed friends afterwards, and Joseph Barnett did actually see her on the night of her murder. Joseph Barnett saw her at about 7:30, 7:45 of the night of her death, stayed about an hour. He saw Lizzie Albrook, who was a local laundress who was friends with Mary Jane Kelly, and she'd left some clothes behind. She was seen at 11:45 by a neighbour taking a fella into her room, and she was heard shouting, "I'm going to go singing, I'm going to go singing." She was heard at about 1 a.m. singing her head off. 2 a.m. A George Hutchinson was seeing her with, she was on her own. She asked him, for sixpence. He declined. He said he was skint. He then saw her a few minutes later on Thrall Street with another gentleman. He then sort of hung round this George Hutchinson for no reason. He saw Mary Jane Kelly and this gentleman go into her room, and he then, for some reason, hung around for 45 minutes and saw no one leave. Slightly odd time frame involved in this murder as well. Around 4 a.m., there were faint shouts of murder heard from the direction of Mary's room. Nobody investigated. Between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., apparently several witnesses saw blind. They saw Mary Kelly walking around. They swore they saw her. But then at 10:45, John McCarthy, who was the landlord, sent Thomas Boyer to collect the rent. There's no answer. So he went to the window and pushed in the paper and the thing, and then through the gap in the broken window, he saw the brutal scene. The autopsy took 2.5 hours. The violence of this body was so intense and so brutal. The whole surface of the abdomen and thighs were removed. He skinned her, basically, from the stomach down to the knees. Both breasts were cut off. The arms were hacked at, and the word they used in the autopsy was hacked. The face was hacked beyond all recognition of features. The neck was severed down to the bone, which we've seen before. That image is horrific. Mm-hmm. The parts were strewn. A lot of talk in the newspapers at the time was talking about the body parts being all over the room. They weren't. They were confined to the immediate bed area. The breasts were, as I said, completely removed. One was placed under her head. The other one was placed by her left foot. The uterus and kidneys were both removed and placed under the head. The liver was removed and placed between her feet. The intestines were removed and strewn across the right side of the body. The spleen was ripped out and placed to the left side of the body. The sheets, as you can see, are covered in blood, and there was a pool of blood underneath the bed, 2 square feet. On the report, it said heart absent. That's all it says. So he took that with him. They classed the weapon as being 150 millimeters long and 25 millimeters wide, similar in the case of the other victims. That's about it, really. It really is that this body was. He destroyed her. He got into that room. He had time to completely go to town and fill out every fantasy he ever wanted. He probably was in this room for hours. The body was unrecognizable. There was talk about the chap that actually first saw the body. He genuinely said he didn't know what he was looking at when he first saw it, and it was more the smell that made him realize that something bad had happened. And then they obviously ran to the police. What do you guys think? Because I mean, this murder, like I said, in all the movies and everything, this is the one that scares you to your core. That somebody can come into your home as well. I think that is part of the reason why it's so terrifying.
Yeah, I agree.
As you look at that image there, as Jamie was saying before, like slabs of flesh were hacked away from her thighs, and that's sort of what we're looking at with some other internal parts there on the table. Thankfully, you can only really sort of make out what's going on. I think that's probably a bit of a blessing, really.
You don't know what you're doing, do you? That's the problem. It's like something from a bad horror movie, in that you don't know what you're looking at. Like I said, yeah. It's a good thing.
It can only be a blessing for sure. There's been a sort of like, obviously, facial features were obviously damaged. This is a reproduction, not a close-up, but obviously of a modern reproduction of what went on with the face. Okay, Jamie's pretty much covered it, but I don't think there's anything else in it. Is there?
He hacked her face, didn't he? He just hacked at it.
It seems like he had a lot more time, like you said. He seemed like because he managed to do this one inside a building as opposed to out on the street, he wasn't limited by the fear of getting caught. Perhaps he was much more, felt a lot safer. and then therefore indulged his desires.
And you also think that at this point he was probably in a full-blown break. Coming soon to the channel, the theories, the suspects. Who was Jack the Ripper?